All right, so I'm going to show another one-page app integration here. So in this case, this is in what's called our MOOC distribution. It's a massively open online course thing. It's supposed to be the basis by which you could make one of those. So the whole point of this system is, generally speaking, content, right? So here's our application. This is Drupal delivered. We've got some web components, starting to make their way into HTML. Cool. We've got some web components making their way into the interface. That's a web component to review. That little hover state is a web component. Neato. So this obviously is not usually part of the interface. We design a little better than that, but it's a prototype of the lower threshold of the interface being delivered via this one-page app approach. That I was talking about in the previous video. So let's click MOOC as app, and we'll see delivering, clean up page titles, whatever, but I'm delivering everything you see from here down. This is Drupal traditional. Everything in here is a one-page app, and so the code for that one-page app, just like yesterday. So we've got modules, and then I made an apps folder. You don't need to. I made a module called MOOC book app, and then I made an apps directory that you do need, and then I put my app in there, my LRN app book. So what LRN app book looks like, we've got some material styles. It's got a name, LRN app book. It is going to make a Iron Ajax request when it spins up. And this is a little different. This is a more sophisticated example than the one I showed previously. So even without routing, show how you could start to make pretty powerful little applications. So Iron Ajax auto, which implies, hey, when the page loads, fire this Ajax call. Then we've got data binding between the source path coming in. If you saw the previous video, if I hit manifest, that's what this value is going to be populated from from Drupal, which will then point to whatever the name of my app is, apps LRM book, and then I'm going to get data from here. And so another little thing I added as a result of this is now you can do /devil, and then you can get some devil debug output if you're having some issues with discovery of location or whatever. So if we look at the callback function, because in our manifest we say, hey, here's the PHP function that I want you to run there at player data. So this is this. In here then I'm saying, hey, if the request comes across with the parameter node, make sure it's a number, load it, make sure they have access to view it, and then do some stuff. Otherwise, this is kind of a magic function in Elms. It's just going to return, hey, this is the content they're looking at. So if there's no context of, like a node 45, if you will. So if we find a node, then we're going to load those blocks that you saw rendered at the top of the page. This is a hack. You would say, hey, this is not the way I would do this, if I could spell the word obviously. So the meat and potatoes of it is right here. So what we're doing is, instead of a traditional Drupal node load, I've loaded up the node, right, via this one function being called. We're going to check markup to make sure it's valid. In this case, we're doing it right against the body, and then we've got the format. So it's going to be filtered, rendered on the server side, and then passed forward to client, right, in this return content body. Then we're also going to look and see, hey, are there menu links associated with this? Is this in a book? And so this is a little performance cheat to have. There's a project called Book Cache. It gets associations. It caches them faster between pages. But the basis is that it's the same thing you do if you ran the node prev and book prev and book next functions, which gets you the association of, hey, here's if you've used the book module before, what the next page is, basically. So what that is delivering, if I click lesson 1, and this is the traditional experience, it's the functions that return what the heck should happen when I click these buttons, right? So the pathing for that. So we return those to the app as far as, hey, here's your content, here's your next page, here's your previous page. We can ignore, this stuff's mostly just messing around with it. But when we look at our book app then, we've got a response handler, and then we've got some two-way data binding set up on the data coming in, and we've got it on the request parameters. And this is what makes it a little more complex than the previous example. So I've then got kind of these placeholders for breadcrumb, nav, content. Then we've got DOM ifs, and DOM if is a Boolean evaluation if the Boolean is true, and then we do two-way data binding, so we can update it, what that association is. Then I want it to print a previous button on the interface, and then if it has a next page, print a next button. So looking in our, following the flow of our application a little bit here, we can see, hey, we're going to load up data from here, and then handle response is going to fire. So we jump down to handle response. We'll see we're going to look through, pull out the object, which will have, response.data. Looking at, just see what that is, right? So it's going to be response.data, and then .contents, and then this is body for all of this. That's breadcrumb, nav. Next is 3, but there's no prev in this response. So we look through and say, okay, well, there's no previous, so then set that to false, which will then trigger the two-way data binding, and then it'll hide that page or show that page. Similar with the next. Content, because I'm doing the rendering still, like Drupal is still handling the rendering server side like it traditionally would. So you can't just set a property like in Polymer, or well, yeah, in Polymer, you can't just set a property. So I couldn't just do like, in this case, how I have root.nextPage. If I did root.nav equals response.content.nav, it's going to encapsulate all the HTML and escape it. So it's a security thing. The way around it, if you are doing trusted, server-side rendered HTML, is that you do, like an inner HTML and spit the contents in there. Obviously, they don't want you doing that for the most part, but that's still available to you because it's JavaScript. So make sure it's from trusted sources. Then let's see what happens. So I got to make it render that, but I've got a next button because my response data on the other side said I could have one. Now, if we look at the next button, so it has next button. On click, we do load next page. And so if we look at load next page, all load next page is doing is saying, hey, look at the Ajax request object that's in here. Go into the params operator and then node and set node, which is either going to be nothing or a node ID, equal to the value of .nextPage. And if we see here, if we got a response from the server of next, then we set it to next page. So the server has said what next and previous links are as far as node 1 through whatever. And then when I click, it's going to append that to the Ajax call. Then what I can do is I can say, hey, Iron Ajax, it has this generate request, which basically just fires off the call again. But I've clicked next or previous, which has changed the input parameters sent to the backend. So in the initial case, we get this, hey, there's no node. But for all subsequent cases, our node is going to be populated by this aspect. And so let's look at this, what ends up happening when I click next, and we'll do an inspect here so you can see. So we'll go to network and do XHRs. Actually, let's just refresh and you can see it. Right, so the initial call goes out the door and it's data, right, and has node, but it's null. And we can look at it and say, hey, that's the response that came back, and then it should load a next button. So when I click the next button, that was stupid fast, I think is the technical term for it. But when you're doing things, obviously without a full-blown page load here, I mean, that's rather insane. So it was 73 milliseconds in this little thing, right? And it's rendering everything on the back end, but it's kicking it out to the front end, via the same wrapped everything that it would have anyway, right? So even like this block, which I don't have wired up correctly yet, I can't click this yet to change pages. That'll be in the near future, but it's already doing the correct location I would be were I actually on page 1. The other interesting thing with this, other than performance and the fact that I can go previous, or I can go previous again, right? And then next and next and next and next, is that these little elements in the page, so some of these are delivered from elsewhere. So like this is actually coming, this is a token. And so that's where you can kind of leverage these hybrid approaches. So this is a token input by a content author, theoretically it was me, but it's allowing the client side or server side rendering to do that heavy lift of turning the token into the thing it's supposed to be, and then the client to focus on these little downstream things. So you see, hey, I have like a whole video player here. Another thing that's pretty cool here is when spec this block, this is the this is a web component of its own, which is in the WYSIWYG area. It's called a LRN aside. But you notice there's no real difference between that loading and any other HTML, because we've already had Drupal, via the Web Components module, dump in the definitions of all these available elements. So then one of the biggest stopgaps right now for me in making this just drop in and swap it out is jQuery, right? So like this is supposed to have aspects of the page that are kind of rendered ahead of time to do event handling, and yes, you could do Drupal behaviors, or I could do these the right way, which is that they should be done entirely as web components. And if they're web components that are self-contained, and this is in this case it's supposed to be a modal flyout, then it'll just work because I already have the definitions on the page, much like this block just works because I already have the definitions loaded in. So beyond speed and wow, web components are neat, and I've got a lot of videos in there. Hey, there's another web component, is the time to build. And so I think that gets lost a lot in these types of conversations, or why I start kind of going crazy about a certain design or development technique. So let's take out the fact that, like, yes, I have helper functions that streamline some of this, right? If I were to do this with just core functions, this is just a performance thing. So that could be taken out. I could take out these entirely, right? These are very specific connotations to my system. And then we take out this, which just implies, hey, there's no node to load. Although if you don't have a starting point, you can't do anything. But so this is a much more reasonable, custom Drupal module. But it's a single function that's dedicated to all of its things it needs to worry about. It's very small, right? This is, 40 some lines. And then even the one-page app really isn't that sophisticated either. I mean, it looks like we wrote a lot, but not really. It's a link, it's a few links and an iron Ajax call. So once you really get the two-way data binding down and how you can mix these different elements from webcomponents.org, it's just like a whole universe pops up. So this took, I believe, a half an hour to make yesterday while I was angrily watching the hockey game. Yeah. So it's a little insane. I think there's still some stuff we can do as far as naming conventions and, making things more OOP so that they'll translate to D8 a little easier. But I mean, we're decoupling so much of the Drupal experience through this approach. And then the next, kind of, well, where do you go like a year from now, right? So if you start hollowing out all of your workflows to use Polymer for these one-page apps, well, at the end of the day, like, let's look at what is this, right? That's running. Well, it's just an element in the page, and so there it is, LRN app book. And so because it's just an element in the page, that's not to say that the other one-page apps I showed the other day, well, they're also single elements in the page. So you could very quickly conceive of making almost like a more traditional one-page app with routing and stuff, right, that just points to these different elements in it, and now you've got a truly headless experience. But this is creating a workflow by which you can actually get there. I'm sure a lot of you are not going to be able to just abandon the projects you're currently working on and say, oh, well, you know, this cool thing came out. Sorry, client, we're going to be like really late on shipping this. But there might be a dashboard or a widget on the page that you could do via Polymer or Web Components to just get your hands dirty with it and see that we can start repurposing these things all over the place, how transformative that's going to be, not just for Drupal, but for web development in general.